Welcome to the Unknown Warrior podcast with Pete and Jason from Squeaky Pedal. So this episode, we're kind of going right back to the start of the Unknown Warrior, looking at kind of the origins of it and kind of where the idea came from.
Yeah, so we're very fortunate to be joined by the author and historian Andrew Richards. His book, The Flag, the story of the Reverend David Railton MC and the tomb of the Unknown Warrior, was a key text when we were researching the story, and we were lucky enough to hear him speak at the National Army Museum last year as well. And so because he's an expert on the Reverend David Railton, who came up with the idea of the Unknown Warrior, we wanted to bring him on the podcast. So big thank you to you, Andrew, for agreeing to do this.
Oh, you're welcome. Nice to be here. Thanks for asking me to come on.
I think that the Reverend David Railton's somebody who people will have heard of in relation to the Unknown Warrior, but there's a lot of sort of mixed information as to where it was that he came up with the idea. But if we start right back from the beginning, so who was the Reverend Railton and what was his role as a padre during the First World War?
Well, David Railton was a Church of England chaplain who actually joined up in 1916. He is the son of George Scott Railton, who was the first commissioner of the Salvation Army. He became a curate at the... He studied at the Bishop's Hostel in Liverpool after leaving Keble College, Oxford. At Oxford, he was part of the Oxford Volunteers when he studied at Keble College, which is the pre-runner to the Oxford University Officer Training Corps, which exists today. And he was in Folkestone when he joined up in January 1916. He was a private soldier whilst he was a curate in Liverpool with the Liverpool Scottish. And he actually became very good friends with the son of his bishop, Bishop Gervase. Of course, Noel Gervase, as we all know, is a double Victoria Cross winner, one of only two, I believe. And he, after he joined up in 1916 in Folkestone, he served with the 18th Northumberland Fusiliers at Armentières and Vimy Ridge before being transferred in May 1916 to the 19th Battalion London Regiment, and served at High Wood, where he won Military Cross for saving an officer and two private soldiers whilst being under sniper fire. He was then with the 19th London Battalion during the winter of 1916-1917 along the Ypres salient. He saw some terrible times there, and he was promoted for his work to the battalion, and he went to the 19th Division and served with them all the way through to the end of the war.
I think it's important to note down there, you've said that he won the Military Cross for bravery. He was very much on the front line, wasn't he? And was exposed to the fighting and what was going on. So he would have seen firsthand the losses that were being experienced on the Western Front.
Oh, absolutely. He was an extremely brave man, but he wasn't reckless with his life. And I say that with, not trying to belittle soldiers who were brave, who died under fire, but he knew that he could do no good being dead. He openly admitted that, padres should be up the front, but, why throw your life needlessly? He was a brave man, but he wasn't going to try to win a medal or anything. And there's hardly any record of what he actually did. I've had to actually piece together from lots of different texts and in letters about actually what he did. And he's such a humble man that he didn't want to take credit for it.
It states in your book the fact that he never mentioned winning the military medal to any of his friends. He just kept it completely quiet, which I think gives you a gauge of the type of man he was.
Well, that's right. I mean, talking to the Railton family too, there was never a record. David Railton QC, who is the grandson of David Railton, said that his father never spoke about the war, and his father, David Railton, never spoke about the war. And they were both and it's funny that Andrew Scott Railton, David Railton's son, actually won the Military Cross in the Second World War. So, brave stock, let's put it that way.
Your book is called The Flag, and obviously it talks about the flag that the Reverend Railton took with him to the front, and that flag, one of the two flags that ended up being with him whilst he was at the front, now hangs in Westminster Abbey. It's really interesting what you say in the book about the fact that one of the reasons he had it with him was that it added colour to what was quite a sort of a dour and drab front line where a lot of these servicemen were for church services. But obviously that flag played an awfully important role in burials as well, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the decision was made before the First World War, actually at the start of the First World War, not to take regimental colours into battle, as they had done in the past. The thought of them being paraded down the Kurfürstendamm in Berlin was horrific. So they didn't take them over there. David actually thought that was a mistake because they could have been kept in the rear and they could have been brought up for church services. So that's one of the reasons he wanted the flag to be there. He would lay the flag out in trenches when he was giving communion to soldiers, if he was conducting burial services or regimental church services, and run it up a makeshift flagpole. And he thought it was a really, really important symbol. And of course, he used it on all sorts of, and several tragic occasions too. He used it at boxing tournaments, and he also used it to give communion to a condemned soldier before he was about to be executed. And so to say that the flag is tinged with the blood of British soldiers is quite accurate.
And I think that, it's important to note that the Reverend Railton would have had, that first-hand experience of the burial of large numbers of soldiers and seen a large number of soldiers killed in the front line, which would then obviously go a long way to forming his views about kind of remembrance and how these soldiers would be commemorated once the war ended, which led into his ideas on the Unknown Warrior.
Absolutely. Particularly at High Wood, the battalion was one of the least affected. When I say least affected, I think it was about 40% losses of the 47th Division at High Wood. So they got spammed for want of a better word, the terrible task of battlefield clearance. Of once High Wood had been cleared of Germans, they actually had to clear the wood, or what was left of it, of the bodies. And I think reading his letters and reading everything that I've come across, it's just one of the worst experiences you could possibly imagine. I just, sat writing about it. I couldn't imagine just what it was like to stumble upon bodies, mutilated bodies of friends, of officers. And in his letters that are at the Imperial War Museum, they were donated by the family. It's striking. I think that of all the things he went through, and I think High Wood was one of the most forming experiences that he had.
And how did all those kind of experiences then lead him to, kind of, as Jace mentioned, obviously his ideas on kind of remembrance and the bloodshed that he'd seen. And so how does that lead him to kind of conceive the idea for the Unknown Warrior? And how do we end up at that? Because obviously there's a little bit of conjecture about kind of the story of that as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. In your first episode, you mentioned that the story he told in the article in 1931, in Our Empire. I mean, that is the story that's given out there and everybody. But I came across a typed up story from the family have still kept, and it's never been published. And I put it in the book. And as he was going to London to hand the flag in for the Unknown Warrior to Dean Ryle at Westminster Abbey, he wanted to give to the press the idea how the flag came about. And he wrote it in the voice of the flag, which is very unusual. And this unpublished manuscript belongs to the family, but I was allowed to use, parts of it. And it really is very enlightening. And actually, in part of it, he said that, and he wrote, bear in mind, he wrote this in 1920, that he didn't actually realize when he came up with the idea. So, I'm not saying that he didn't have this idea in Armentières. I think it's, you have to think that it's 11 years after the event. It's like, I know you guys have been talking about, people getting things wrong, 20 years after the event. I think this all kind of ties up. But it's a great story, and I have no doubt that he came across the simple white wooden cross in the garden of the house he was staying in Erkingham, near Armentières. And, that's the story he used in 1931, and I'm not saying that's not right, but in 1920 he wrote a different story about he was on a horse coming from a church service, and he doesn't quite remember how it happened. But it's all very interesting.
I think that's conceivable, though, isn't it? Because there's any creative idea or whatever. There's not necessarily a one eureka moment. It kind of happens over time, and as you say, the mind is a wonderful thing that kind of fills in the gaps of whatever. And
you have to remember, his mind was in turmoil. He clearly suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. I think one of his, you asked the question about what his motivation was. I think his letters to family members, and his family still have some of those in the archives. They were a great source of comfort. He wrote to every soldier that he buried, to their families. And it was a great source of comfort to receive letters back and know that they had been buried, and he was with them in many cases as they died in casualty clearing stations and aid posts. And I think the letters, more than anything else, were one of his motivating factors for this idea. I really do. I think if he could give an idea, if he could bring forward something that would help these families in the suffering after the war, that gave him great comfort himself for a man who was as traumatized as he was.
So he's conceived of this idea. What does he then decide to do? He sits on it, doesn't he, for quite a while, really, before he sort of puts it out there.
Yeah, I think the genius of this is the patience he showed when he got back. I mean, you have to remember the time that he was going through. It was 1919. The world was in absolute turmoil. There was revolution everywhere. And the fact that he didn't write this letter straight away and sat on it and thought, I can't do this, and I think is the absolute genius. And he hit the nail on the head exactly at the right time when he wrote that letter in August of 1920. And he wrote it to the right person too, into Dean Herbert Royal, the Dean of Westminster. And he also, there are stories out that he wrote to Lord Hague during the war. I've never found that evidence. He actually said he thought about writing to Lord Hague, but I've never found anything to say that he actually did. And I think writing to Lord Hague would have been a mistake, because I think it would have been dismissed. Because I think Lord Hague was focused on other things, and he might have been very dismissive about it. But I think it hit it perfectly on the head. And I think you have to bring in the state of the Church of England at the time, the Anglican Church. They had basically had the national symbol of commemoration taken away from them as such. If the Church of England had their way, where the cenotaph is now, there would be a huge white stone cross. I have no doubt about that. That's what they wanted, as you see in villages up and down the countryside. But when Lutyens was given the task of building a monument, it was basically a secular monument. They hated this. They really did. And so when the opportunity came and the idea came into the lap of Dean Herbert Royal, the church grasped it, and you can't blame them. They took this idea and to bring it into the center. And Westminster Abbey is literally the center of the Anglican Church. And so I think the genius behind the idea is not only the person they wrote to, but also the timing when it happened.
A lot of life is about timing, the way that we do things, just forward at the right time, and then that sort of gains the traction that we need to get things done. There's obviously stories about the fact that the Prime Minister was interested but the King wasn't, and then he had to be sort of brought round. But again, that might be sort of conjecture really from what's mentioned.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I've read early on when I was researching this book, is the fact that, the King said no, the King said no. The King didn't say no. He had doubts about it. He thought that the country was healing, and he thought that bringing it up would tear a rent through society. And he was clearly wrong. But he also said, however, and, in the letter, you have to read it, it says, however, comma, and then goes on to say, I'll put your idea past X, Y, and Z. So he never said no. I think it's kind of blown out of proportion, really. He was doubtful that the idea would take on, but he was convinced by Lord George into doing it. And I think, as we all know, it's just an incredible thing to have done, and it's lasted 100 years.
There's an amazing bit in your book where you describe David going to the commemoration, the laying to rest of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey, how there was a chill in the air because obviously we're getting towards autumn and winter, but the strength of feeling that was there, seeing the amounts of people who'd come out to witness this, not only the laying to rest of the unknown warrior but the unveiling of the new cenotaph as well. It creates a really powerful image. What do you think David would have felt at that moment when he saw this idea that he'd had on the Western Front come to life in such a public way?
There's very little about what he felt. He never wrote about what he felt. Incorrectly, many people have written that he was at the cenotaph and would have seen all this, but he clearly wasn't. There's photographs that were in the family archive of him, his wife and his mother in front of Buckingham Palace. So they'd arrived at Victoria Station. They walked to Buckingham Palace in the mist. They wouldn't have seen anything because of the smog at the time that was around that morning. And then they walked to Westminster Abbey and were in Westminster Abbey just a few feet away from the royal family. They had tickets to go in there. So I don't actually think he would have understood. He would have gone into the Abbey and that was it. He wouldn't have seen anything until afterwards. And I think it's afterwards when going back to Victoria Station again, he would have seen the queues, the lines of people waiting to file past the cenotaph to go in to pay tribute to the unknown warrior. I don't think it's much later until he would have, and I think he would have read the newspapers and seen, that some of the descriptions by him, particularly in the Times, some of the writers of the time were, the very flowery prose, people just don't write in the newspapers as they used to. It's very, very moving. They had stories of, you could hear nothing but some of the metal on the gun carriage and the horses' hooves and the soldiers marching. I don't think we've had a ceremonial procession like this. I don't even think the funeral service of Diana, Princess of Wales, it's certainly up there, and it's very, very, it's an incredible occasion. But I don't think we've ever had anything like the burial of the unknown warrior. And the thing is, we really haven't got much record. We have the descriptions of the Times, and then we have the Pathé newsreel that in black and white. And you just have to look at that and study that and see the crowds and how deep they were. They were 20 deep all the way along the Mall and around Hyde Park Corner. It's just incredible, the amount of people that came out.
And he continued his remarkable work after the war, didn't he? As a reverend, but also as a pillar for the community, looking after the poor within his own parish, and also trying to explore. There was a famous episode of him sort of pretending to be a tramp and going round and experiencing that for himself and being able to relate to some of the poor in society who needed his help after the war.
Absolutely. He was driven by looking after those who were less fortunate than most of us. And, he dedicated himself to soldiers in 1916. He, early on in his service, in one of his letters, he wrote to his wife, if God spares me from this war, I will spend the rest of my life in service to the men who fought here. Or, I paraphrase, I haven't got it in front of me, but he was going to dedicate his life to the soldiers. And he didn't just do that, he did that for the poor too. The whole episode of him going on several tramps. I know for a fact he went on one around the Carlisle area because the family had a house there. The family also, on his wife's side, his mother-in-law, they had a house up near Windy Newark, south of Newcastle. And I know for a fact that he actually went on a tramp around the mines there, but I couldn't put that in the books. I couldn't actually say for fact that happened, and I didn't have any. But from all the descriptions, that's what he did. He wanted to see how it was, and when he came back, he wrote about it and said, "Look, our serving soldiers are in a terrible state, and this is what's happening."
I think that's important to remember, is that the fact that obviously those soldiers suffered. In the depressions and the tough economic times that happened in the 20s and 30s, they may have served their country and there may be monuments to what they did during the First World War, but then the interwar period they were struggling, and so it's really important to say that he didn't forget about them. He kept trying to help them in any way that he could.
Absolutely. I mean, he loved private soldiers. He also loved the senior officers. He thought the senior officers, people like Haig, had a terrible job. And with all the criticism of it, he was never critical of Haig. He was critical of other officers who threw away lives needlessly, but he was never critical of Haig. And certainly after the war, when Haig, started the Haig Foundation, and he dedicated his life as much as David Railton. The both of them basically it paralleled towards helping serving soldiers, and. You mentioned that Lord Haig is dedicating the rest of his life, and I think he did that. I don't want to get into being critical of his war tactics, etc., but there's no doubt that Haig worked extremely hard after the war, as David Railton did, for ex-soldiers.
I think it makes it kind of all the more pertinent when you know about the man behind it, that he was so kind of selfless, wasn't he? He was so selfless. It wasn't after the glory of, I'm the man that came up with this idea. It was just that he sort of did it, and then it was like, it's the nation's, everyone's to kind of do and go to as you wish. It kind of just makes it all the more powerful, really.
Absolutely, he was completely selfless. I mean, one of the issues I had was finding information about him, because he never wrote about himself. There was a little bit of those days of, a gentleman never talks about what one did in the war, but he really was like that, and it was difficult. But he was a great note taker. He scribbled on everything, postcards. If somebody wrote to him, he'd write a little note, like he was leaving it for posterity. It really was like little breadcrumbs everywhere. when I was, I was so lucky, and I'm still very, very thankful to the Relton family for allowing me to get into their archives and letters. And it's incredible. He kept everything.
I think that's the thing when you're exploring these things. You're reading about somebody in history, but then to have their personal correspondence, to have their letters, to have their writing, it just allows you to connect with those people on a different level. And I think that's something that we've discovered through looking at archival documents and ID cards and orders. It just sort of brings it home. It's not just something in a history book. It's real, and I think that it just adds a different perspective on it for yourself, you know what I mean, when you're going through these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
It always brings it into 3D, doesn't it, kind of when you go through that kind of stuff. Brings it off the page, as it were, yeah.
It certainly does.
Well, I think that's a superb exploration of David Railton's life and his idea for the Unknown Warrior. So we'd just like to say a big thank you for coming on the podcast and talking to us about David, Andy, and we will speak to you soon.
All right, thanks very much. My pleasure.